books, right? Your book Body Parts was your third book. It came out in 2009, recently reissued with 32 pages of new material, and it is about a serial killer named Wayne Adam Ford who walks into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office in 1998 and turns himself in even though no one's looking for him. Tell us who Wayne Adam Ford was and what he did that makes him different.
Well, I want to just finish that one story. He walked into the Eureka police station, sheriff's station, and when he said, I hurt some people. So when they came out to talk to him, he started going for his pocket, and they said, well, what are you doing? And he says, well, I just need to show you something. And he pulls out a baggie with a woman's severed breast in it. And it looked, I understand it looked like a piece of chicken. So I hope you guys have a strong stomach. I hope there's no children. Anyway, so that's what made national news. And Marcia was reminding me, you know, when you write a true crime book, you have to see what else has been written, if something else has been written, because the publishers want to know, well, what can you do that's new and different? So there was already a book that came before this one by a man who has since passed away, did not actually even get to the trial. So I was able to, you know, in my mind, I said, well, how can I advance this story? So I basically went to the sentencing hearing, and I started basically at the end and had to work backwards. So I saw him in court. I had a photographer friend. I was working at the San Diego Union Tribune at the time, and he came with me and he took a bunch of pictures for me, which appear in the book. This book was so dark that I couldn't even look at the autopsy photos, so I asked my friend, the photographer, to just take pictures of things. But anyway, so Wayne Adam Ford was a long-haul trucker, and he was, you know, when he was young, he was a handsome guy. He worked in the Marines in El Toro in Orange County. He drove a school bus for disabled children. He sung karaoke, and he seemed like a good guy. His father had been in military intelligence, the U.S. Army, so he'd grown up with his brother on a bunch of military bases in Europe and other places. His mother was bipolar and tried to kill herself a few times. She also told Ford that he was the product of rape, so that his father raped his mother, and he was the result of that. So also when Ford was in the Marines, he was learning about first aid. And so he was out on a date with a woman who later became his wife, and he stopped. He said, let's stop, I want to see if I can help. So he goes over to help the passenger who was bleeding, and he put his hand to stop the bleeding on the person's carotid artery. And in the process, a drunk driver came and hit him and knocked him 40 feet down an embankment and pretty much knocked off his jaw and gave him a severe head injury. So a lot of the people who are on death row have actually had pretty severe head injuries. That's one of the things that's common. So apparently his personality changed somewhat dramatically after that. He had been kind of kinky before that and did some weird things. But what was difficult to write in this book was where he went in his mind, and I had to be in his mind that whole time. He basically admitted after he turned himself in, he kept talking. He asked for an attorney, but then he kept talking. So that became an issue in the case, because I watched his booking video and he was just an absolute mess. He was crying. He didn't make sense a lot of the time. I read a lot of the interviews, transcripts, and there was also audio, which I listened to. So 4 different counties, they found women in waterways. The first woman, he dismembered completely in his bathtub. All they found was her torso. So they called her Jane Doe, affectionately Torso Girl. The reason that I updated this book recently is because 25 years later, after he murdered her, they were finally able to identify her through genetic genealogy. So if there's anything that's possible as a happy ending to a serial killer book, at least I feel good about being able to help the family get closure and get this woman's name back for her. So it's Carrie Ann Cummings, so we now know who she was. So she was the first of 4 victims, and he basically confessed while he was, speaking to these different detectives who drove up and came up to interview him. And so he didn't have an attorney until later in the interviews. So some of these interviews were thrown out because he had asked for an interview, had asked for an attorney. But he basically would pick up these troubled women. Many of them were prostitutes. If they weren't prostitutes, they were, troubled and using drugs. So they were vulnerable women. He'd pick them up. He'd have sex with them in his truck, and it was consensual, but these women did not sign up for the kind of sex that he then subjected them to. So he basically would torture them, and he would choke them until they passed out, and then he would bring them back with CPR. And ironically, the way that he would choke them was by pressing on their carotid artery, just like he helped that accident victim at the side of the freeway. So there were 4 of them, and when he got to the 4th one, that's whose severed breast he had in his pocket when he turned himself in. He couldn't stop. He knew he would kill again. And the thing about this guy that's different is I don't know of any other serial killer that turned himself in, but he did. So I originally wanted to call this book Killer with a Conscience, but my publisher didn't like that. They wanted to call it Body Parts, which I thought was insensitive to the families of the victims. But the original book cover said, and he kept them in his pocket, which I also fought against, but that was, sensational true crime books are kind of like that. Anyway, so he turned himself in with his brother's help. He knew that he was probably going to back out at the last minute, which he did try to do, but he said, I need your help, come up. So they met at a motel, and then his brother came in with him the next day.
Now, why was this book important for you to write? I mean, it's very gruesome material. You mentioned in your book that it took a toll on you, that your 15 other books did not, and you would not necessarily want to do this type of book again. What about this material screamed out book-length treatment?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. Screamed out.
What about this material suggested a full-length book as the...
Well, I didn't know how dark it was going to get. First of all, I mean, I knew he was a serial killer. I hadn't written a book about a serial killer before. And it was, I was a psychology major at Berkeley. I've always been very interested in mental health issues. When I was a reporter, I used to cover mental illness and mentally ill inmates in jails and in prisons and how that was handled by the state corrections system and also the county. So that was just one of my interests. And as I just am sort of drawn to these stories with killers who have some sort of mental health issue or addiction. So this guy, as I found out, I didn't know this, I just knew he was a serial killer who turned himself in, and that to me was what drew me to the story. And and he turned himself in with a breast in his pocket. I'm like, okay, well that's a pretty different kind of story. But as I started getting into all the exhibits, so this was a really interesting research project. So at the San Bernardino County Courthouse, the clerk's office, the exhibits, this wouldn't probably happen today. They're much more restrictive and much more tight about these things, but I was basically getting witness interviews. So for example, there was an interview with his mother by the defense investigator, and that told all about his childhood and about all of her issues and all of her claims. And then I went ahead and I interviewed his brother and his father, and the mother and the father, of course, had completely disparate narratives about everything that had happened, and so it was very difficult to kind of put those together. But the more I got into it, the darker it got. And it turned out he had a borderline personality disorder. Well, I was married to somebody that had borderline personality disorder, so I, felt that I had some insight there, but again, it was dark and it was difficult for me to kind of get deeper and deeper into this man's head. And he had a whole lot of paraphilias, which I didn't even know what those were before I started researching this book. So they're basically like fetishes times 10. And they're gruesome and graphic, but interesting for someone who's a psychology major. So it was interesting and fascinating and also just extremely dark. And it got so dark that it ended up affecting me mentally and physically, so.
Well, you touched on something there that I'm very interested in, which is the challenges of putting these books together, the research that's involved. Having done a few books myself, I know there comes a point when you